To discuss this further, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Mark Kimmitt. He's an advisor to US firms in the Middle East and a former Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Kimmitt. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this is far from the first kind of agreement which aims to end the war in Syria, to say nothing of the rocky relations that the US and Russia are currently experiencing. How is this agreement different to anything else we've seen in Syria?
Well, the first difference is that it is an agreement, which we've never seen before, even though it's a very flawed agreement, even though it's got as many holes as a brick of Swiss cheese. It is an agreement and an understanding on both sides that they want to take positive steps towards not only ending the conflict, but ending the suffering.
Okay, so first off the bat, you really haven't given this agreement a big rap, saying it's got more holes than a block of Swiss cheese. So what kind of sentiment do you have for this deal actually being successful?
Well, I sort of share the same view of Secretary of State Kerry. He did not use firm words. He says, I hope, I believe, if. I think he himself understands that this agreement is on very shaky grounds, very shaky foundation, and has a very, very low probability of leading to anything consequential.
Okay, Mr. Kimmitt, so let's say everything works out swell between the US and Russia. There's still another major party to consider here, and that is Bashar al-Assad and his regime. What's the likelihood of them playing ball with this kind of deal?
Well, actually, to be precise, there are two additional parties. There's not only the Assad regime, who is not in agreement, although they were consulted, and there are also the rebels who are not in agreement but were consulted. And even though there's been somewhat of an agreement between Russia and the United States, it doesn't bode well for this agreement that the major belligerents, the Assad regime and the rebels, weren't part of this and are not party nor have agreed to this.
Mr. Kimmitt, it seems from what you're telling me that your outlook for this agreement seems to be shaky at best. What would you be suggesting, given your experience in the Middle East, to actually end this war or have any kind of impact in the war in Syria?
Well, first, like many of my colleagues from the U.S. military, I believe that ending the war at this point may be too far of a leap. What we should be doing is at least trying to provide humanitarian assistance, perhaps setting up no-fly zones so the delivery of humanitarian assistance can at least stop the enormous suffering that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. After that, we can only hope that there is exhaustion, as we saw in former Yugoslavia, where the sides finally tire of the conflict and come to an agreement. It is important to note that that had almost been achieved about a year and a half ago when the Assad regime was really on its back feet. But when the Russians came in to bolster up the Assad regime, that gave them new life, and we've seen no suspension on the part of the Assad regime to stop the fighting.
The idea of no-fly zones to deliver humanitarian aid seems like an excellent one, and one that many has proposed. But if you can't get the US, Russia, the Assad regime and rebel groups to all agree on something like that, I mean, the cessation of hostilities, which was brought into play earlier this year, eventually failed. How are we any chance of creating no-fly zones?
Well, in many ways, no-fly zones are a little bit different. You don't negotiate a no-fly zone, you impose a no-fly zone. We imposed a no-fly zone in northern Iraq in 1991. We imposed a no-fly zone in southern Iraq in 1991, and those were successful in the 10 years after the end of the first Gulf War to allow humanitarian assistance to the Kurds and humanitarian assistance to the Shiites in southern Iraq. So I don't necessarily believe you have to negotiate a no-fly zone. You just have to impose it and challenge the other belligerents to try to violate it.
Mark Kimmitt in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your insight on this topic.